The hospital cafeteria buzzed with the chaos of lunch hour. Every table packed with nurses, doctors, visitors, and patients in wheelchairs. And Olivia Foster stood near the entrance with her tray of questionable meatloaf, scanning desperately for an empty seat. She'd been on her feet for 6 hours straight as a pediatric physical therapist, her stomach growling so loudly she was certain the elderly woman passing by had heard it. That's when she spotted him, sitting alone at a table meant for 4, his shoulders hunched as he stared at an untouched sandwich. "Can I sit here?" "Everywhere's full," she asked, already moving toward the empty chair across from him. Preston Kane looked up, and for a moment, his expression was so raw with relief that Olivia almost took a step back. He'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, watching people choose to crowd around other tables, to stand rather than ask to join him. He wasn't sure why he'd come down to the cafeteria at all instead of staying in his father's room on the cardiac floor, but the walls had been closing in, and he'd needed to breathe. And then she'd appeared, with kind eyes and scrubs covered in cartoon puppies, and asked the question he'd been desperately hoping someone would ask. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair with more enthusiasm than the situation probably warranted. "Please sit." Olivia settled into the chair, offering him a warm smile before diving into her meal. She had exactly 30 minutes before her next appointment with a 7-year-old recovering from a car accident, and she intended to use every second to refuel. But something about the man across from her caught her attention. He was handsome in that exhausted, rumpled way that suggested he'd been wearing the same clothes for too long. His dark hair stuck up in places like he'd been running his hands through it, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Rough day?" she asked between bites. Preston let out a sound that was half laugh, half sigh. "Rough week, month, year, maybe." He paused, realizing how pathetic that sounded. "Sorry. That was more honest than you probably wanted from a stranger." "No, I get it," Olivia said, her voice gentle. "I work in pediatric PT, and sometimes the weight of it all just sits on your chest, you know. But we're in a hospital, so I'm guessing you're here for someone." "My father," Preston admitted, finally picking up his sandwich only to set it back down. "Heart attack. Triple bypass surgery yesterday. He's stable, but—" He trailed off, not sure how to explain the complicated tangle of emotions that came with almost losing the only parent he had left. Olivia's expression softened. "I'm so sorry. That's terrifying. Are you here alone?" The question hit harder than she'd probably intended. "Yeah," Preston said quietly. "It's just been me and him for a long time. My mom passed when I was 14. "I'm sorry," Olivia repeated, and she meant it. She'd seen enough grief and fear in these halls to recognize it instantly. "For what it's worth, the cardiac unit here is incredible, Doctor. Morrison did my uncle's bypass 3 years ago, and he's out there playing golf and annoying my aunt like nothing ever happened." Preston found himself smiling despite everything. "That's good to hear. Really." They fell into comfortable conversation, the kind that happens between strangers who have nothing to lose by being honest. Olivia told him about her work, about the kids she helped regain mobility and strength after accidents or illnesses, about the little victories that made the hard days worth it. Preston talked about his father, about the hardware store they'd built together, carefully omitting the part where that single hardware store had turned into a chain of 200 across 15 states, generating millions in annual revenue. He wasn't sure why he held back that information, except that he was so tired of people's eyes changing when they learned about his wealth. "I should get back," Olivia said reluctantly, checking her watch. "But hey, if you're here tomorrow around the same time and need someone to sit with, I'm usually grabbing lunch around noon." Preston felt something in his chest loosen. "I'd like that. I'm Preston, by the case you were wondering." "Olivia," she said, standing and gathering her tray. "It's nice to meet you, Preston. I hope your dad continues to improve." He watched her weave through the crowded cafeteria, her ponytail swinging, and felt the first spark of something other than anxiety he'd experienced in days. She'd chosen his table. Out of everywhere in that packed cafeteria, she'd chosen him. The next day, Preston found himself in the cafeteria at 11:45, securing the same table and hoping he didn't look too eager. His father was doing better, complaining about the hospital food and the uncomfortable bed, which the nurses assured Preston were excellent signs. But Preston still found himself drawn back to the cafeteria, back to the possibility of seeing Olivia again. She appeared at 12:05, her scrubs today decorated with smiling dinosaurs, and her face lit up when she spotted him. "You're here," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. "I'm here," he confirmed, feeling ridiculously happy about it. "How's your day going?" "Good. Great, actually. One of my patients took his first unassisted steps today. His parents cried, I cried. It was a whole thing." She sat down across from him, and Preston noticed she'd brought 2 chocolate chip cookies. She slid one across the table to him. "You look like you could use some real food." "Hospital sandwiches don't count." Preston accepted the cookie, touched by the small gesture. "Thank you, and that's amazing about your patient." "It's why I do this job," Olivia said, breaking off a piece of her cookie. Those moments when you see someone accomplish something they weren't sure they'd ever do again. It never gets old. They talked for the full 30 minutes of her lunch break, and then Preston walked with her as far as the elevator, neither of them quite ready to say goodbye. This pattern continued for the next 5 days. Every day at noon, they'd meet in the cafeteria, share a table, and talk about everything and nothing. Preston learned that Olivia had 2 brothers, both older and both constantly trying to set her up on dates with their friends. Olivia learned that Preston had played baseball in college and still missed it sometimes. On day 6, Preston's father was moved out of the cardiac ICU into a regular room, and the doctors started talking about discharge plans. Preston knew he should feel relieved, and he did, but there was also a thread of panic winding through his chest. Once his father was home, Preston wouldn't have a reason to be at the hospital every day. He wouldn't have a reason to see Olivia. "That's wonderful news," Olivia said when he told her about his father's progress, and she meant it, but there was something in her eyes that mirrored his own concern. She'd come to look forward to these lunch hours, to Preston's dry humor and the way he really listened when she talked. She dated enough to know that most guys just waited for their turn to speak, but Preston asked follow-up questions and remembered details she'd mentioned days ago. "Yeah, it is," Preston agreed. Then, before he could lose his nerve, he added, "I was wondering if maybe we could get coffee sometime." "Outside of the hospital, I mean." Olivia's smile was immediate and genuine. "I'd really like that." They exchanged phone numbers, and 2 days later, after Preston's father was safely discharged and settled at home with a visiting nurse, Preston texted Olivia to ask if she was free that weekend. She responded within minutes with an enthusiastic yes, and they made plans to meet at a coffee shop near the hospital on Saturday morning. Preston arrived early, his nerves jangling in a way they hadn't since he was a teenager. He'd built a multi-million-dollar empire, negotiated deals with major suppliers, and given presentations to boards of directors. But the thought of this coffee date had him checking his reflection in the shop's window 3 times. He wore jeans and a simple button-down, nothing too fancy, still maintaining the careful fiction that he was just a regular guy who helped run a hardware store. Olivia showed up right on time, wearing a blue sundress that brought out her eyes, her hair down in waves around her shoulders instead of the usual ponytail. Preston stood to greet her, and for a moment, they both just stood there grinning at each other like idiots. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he echoed. "You look beautiful." She blushed, pleased. "Thanks. You clean up pretty nice yourself." They ordered their drinks, Preston insisting on paying despite Olivia's protests, and found a cozy table by the window. Without the time constraints of her lunch break, conversation flowed even more easily. They talked for 2 hours, until their coffee cups were long empty and the barista had refilled them twice. Preston learned that Olivia had wanted to be a dancer when she was young, but had torn her ACL in high school, which led her to physical therapy, and eventually to choosing it as a career. Olivia learned that Preston had taught himself to cook after his mother died because his father had been useless in the kitchen, and they'd both gotten tired of takeout. "So it's been over a week since you've seen him?" Olivia asked, referring to Preston's father. "How's he doing at home?" "Driving the nurse crazy, mostly," Preston said with a fond smile. "He's not great at sitting still, but he's following orders, taking his medications, and he seems to have actually scared himself enough to take this seriously." "That's good. Sometimes it takes a real wake-up call." She stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "And how are you doing? I know you were pretty stressed when we first met." Preston felt something warm spread through his chest at her concern. "I'm better. A lot better, actually. Meeting you helped more than you probably realize." Those lunch conversations were the best part of some really difficult days. Olivia reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm glad I asked to sit with you that day." "So am I," Preston said softly. "Really glad." When they finally left the coffee shop, Preston asked if she wanted to walk through the nearby park, and Olivia agreed immediately. They strolled along the paths, their conversation never lagging, and at some point, their hands found each other and intertwined. It felt natural, right? Like they'd been doing this for years instead of barely 2 weeks. "Can I see you again?" Preston asked as they circled back toward where they'd parked. "Soon. How about tomorrow?" Olivia suggested, her eyes sparkling. "There's a farmer's market downtown on Sunday mornings. We could get breakfast and walk around." "That sounds perfect." They saw each other 4 times that next week. The farmer's market on Sunday, dinner at a small Italian restaurant on Tuesday, a movie on Thursday, and an impromptu lunch on Saturday when Olivia texted him that she had a free afternoon and asked if he wanted to check out a new taco place that had just opened. By the end of that month, they were seeing each other almost every day, and Preston was completely, hopelessly falling for her. But the lie about his wealth was starting to eat at him. Every time Olivia suggested splitting the check, every time she mentioned saving up for a vacation, every time she talked about her student loans, Preston felt the weight of his deception grow heavier. He'd never actually lied to her, he told himself. He just hadn't corrected her assumptions. But that felt like semantics at this point, and he knew he needed to tell her the truth. The problem was timing. 3 weeks into dating, Olivia invited him over for dinner at her apartment, a cozy 1-bedroom in a converted house that she shared with a rotating gallery of plants she was constantly trying to keep alive. She'd made chicken parmesan, and was so proud of how it turned out that Preston couldn't bring himself to dampen the mood with his confession. A week after that, Olivia had a rough day at work, losing a patient she'd been working with for months, and Preston spent the evening just holding her while she cried. That wasn't the right time either. 2 months into their relationship, Preston's father invited them both over for dinner. Harold Kane was doing remarkably well, back to his usual self, except for the new diet restrictions he grumbled about constantly. He'd been eager to meet the woman who'd put the smile back on his son's face, and Preston had nervously agreed to bring Olivia by. "Your dad's house is amazing," Olivia said as Preston pulled into the driveway of the sprawling property in the suburbs. The house was nice, a comfortable 4-bedroom with a well-maintained yard, but it was hardly a mansion. Preston had bought it for his father 5 years ago, something modest that Harold had actually agreed to accept. The estate Preston owned on the other side of town was another story entirely. "He likes having space for a garden," Preston said, which was true. His father had taken up gardening after retiring from the day-to-day operations of the business, claiming he needed to do something with his hands. Harold greeted them at the door with a warmth that immediately put Olivia at ease. He was a stocky man with gray hair and kind eyes, and Olivia could see where Preston got his smile. Over pot roast and potatoes, Harold regaled them with stories from Preston's childhood, much to Preston's embarrassment and Olivia's delight. "Did he tell you about the time he tried to build a treehouse when he was 9? Harold asked, his eyes twinkling. "Took every piece of scrap wood from the store, drew up these elaborate plans, and ended up with something that looked like a strong breeze would knock it over." "It stood for 3 years, Preston protested, laughing. "That's structural integrity right there." "It stood because I went out there after you went to bed and reinforced every joint," Harold countered. "But I never told you that because you were so proud of yourself." Olivia watched the easy affection between them, her heart full. She'd been nervous about meeting Preston's father, worried about making a good impression, but Harold had made her feel like family from the moment she'd walked in the door. As they were clearing the dishes, Harold pulled Preston aside in the kitchen while Olivia was in the bathroom. "She's wonderful, son. Don't mess this up." "I'm trying not to," Preston said quietly, "but I need to tell her about the business, about the money. I should have done it weeks ago." Harold's expression grew serious. "Yes, you should have. The longer you wait, the worse it's going to look. She deserves to know who you really are." "I know. I'm going to tell her soon. I just need to find the right moment." "The right moment is before she finds out some other way," Harold warned. "Trust me on this." Preston knew his father was right, but fear kept stopping him. What if Olivia felt deceived? What if she couldn't get past the fact that he'd let her believe he was someone else? What if everything changed once she knew about the money? The decision was taken out of his hands 3 days later. Olivia had taken a personal day from work, and they decided to spend it exploring some antique shops downtown. They were browsing through a store full of vintage furniture when Olivia's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and groaned. "It's my brother David. Hold on." She answered with an exasperated, "What do you want?" Preston pretended to examine an old typewriter while trying not to eavesdrop, but Olivia's side of the conversation was hard to miss. "No, I'm not free for dinner Friday. I told you I'm seeing someone. Yes, I'm sure it's serious." "David, I don't care if your friend owns a dental practice. I'm not interested. Because I have a boyfriend, that's why. His name is Preston Kane, and before you ask, yes, he has a job. He works in hardware." There was a long pause, and Preston glanced over to see all the color drain from Olivia's face. "What do you mean, Preston Kane?" "Yes, that's his name." "What article?" Preston's stomach dropped. This was it. This was exactly the scenario he'd been dreading. Olivia lowered the phone, her expression unreadable. "My brother says there's an article in this month's business journal about the most successful entrepreneurs under 40. Apparently, you're number 3. Preston Kane, founder and CEO of Kane's Home and Hardware, estimated net worth $87 million. Her voice was completely flat. "Is that you?" Preston felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "Olivia, I can explain." "Is that you?" she repeated, her voice harder now. "Yes," he admitted, seeing no point in denying it. "But please, let me explain why I didn't tell you." Olivia's eyes were filling with tears, and Preston would have preferred anger. Anger he could handle, but the hurt and betrayal in her expression made him feel like the worst person alive. "I need to go," she said, her voice shaking. She told her brother she'd call him back and headed for the door. Preston followed her out onto the street. "Olivia, please, just give me 5 minutes to explain." "Explain what?" she said, whirling to face him. "Explain how you've been lying to me for 2 months. How you let me talk about my student loans and my tiny apartment and saving up for a vacation while you're worth almost $100 million. How you let me offer to split checks and insisted it was no big deal." "I never lied," Preston said weakly. "I just didn't correct your assumptions." "That's the same thing," Olivia shot back. "I told you everything about me, Preston. Everything. And you've been pretending to be someone you're not this entire time. Did you think it was funny?" Poor little physical therapist falling for the millionaire slumming it. "No," Preston said vehemently. "God, no, Olivia. It wasn't like that at all. When we met, I was exhausted and terrified about my father, and you were so kind and you treated me like a normal person. Do you know how rare that is? Everyone changes when they find out about the money. They want something, or they start acting different, or they see dollar signs instead of me. But you just saw me, and I didn't want that to change. So you lied," Olivia said, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "You didn't trust me enough to be honest." "I wanted to tell you," Preston insisted. "I tried to find the right time, but there never was one, and the longer I waited, the harder it got. I know I messed up. I know I should have told you from the beginning, but Olivia, everything between us is real. My feelings for you are real. I'm falling in love with you, and that has nothing to do with money or who we are on paper. Please don't let this ruin what we have." Olivia wiped at her eyes, her expression torn. "I need time to think. I need to process this. I can't do this right now." "Okay," Preston said, his heart breaking. "Okay, take whatever time you need, but please know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I hurt you. That was never my intention." Olivia nodded once, then turned and walked to her car. Preston watched her drive away, feeling like he'd just lost the best thing that had ever happened to him. The next week was the longest of Preston's life. He texted Olivia twice, keeping the messages short and non-demanding, just letting her know he was thinking of her and that he was there when she was ready to talk. She didn't respond to either message, and Preston tried to respect her need for space while simultaneously going out of his mind with worry. He threw himself into work, spending long hours at the office reviewing expansion proposals and meeting with his management team. But nothing could distract him from the Olivia-shaped hole in his life. He missed her laugh, her stories about her patients, the way she wrinkled her nose when she was thinking hard about something. He missed the way she fit perfectly against his side when they watched movies, and how she always stole his fries even when she'd ordered her own. On day 8, Preston's father called him. "Still haven't heard from her." "No," Preston said miserably. "I don't think I'm going to, Dad. I think I really blew it this time." "Maybe," Harold said bluntly. "But you don't strike me as someone who gives up that easily. If you love her, fight for her. And I mean really fight, not just send a couple of text messages and hope for the best. What do you suggest I do?" "Show up at her apartment, her work. That feels like stalking." "Write her a letter," Harold suggested. "A real one on paper. Tell her everything you should have told her from the start. Put it all out there and let her decide what to do with it. But at least she'll know exactly how you feel." Preston spent that entire evening writing and rewriting a letter to Olivia. He went through draft after draft, crumpling up pages and starting over when the words didn't feel right. Finally, at 2 in the morning, he had something he was satisfied with. Something honest and raw that laid out exactly how he felt, why he'd made the choices he'd made, and how much she meant to him. The next morning, he drove to the hospital and asked at the front desk if they could deliver the letter to Olivia Foster in the pediatric physical therapy department. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, agreed to make sure Olivia got it. Olivia was in the middle of a session with a 5-year-old learning to walk with a prosthetic leg when the receptionist brought her the letter. She saw Preston's name on the envelope, and her heart started racing. She'd spent the past week and a half alternating between anger, hurt, and confusion. Part of her felt completely betrayed, like their entire relationship had been built on a lie. But another part, the part that remembered every conversation, every laugh, every tender moment, insisted that what they'd had was real. She'd talked to her best friend Rachel about it for hours, trying to work through her feelings. Rachel had pointed out that while Preston definitely should have been honest sooner, his reasoning made sense. Wealth on that scale did change how people treated you, and finding someone who cared about you for yourself must be nearly impossible. But Olivia couldn't get past the fact that he'd had multiple opportunities to tell her, and hadn't taken any of them. She waited until her lunch break to open the letter, finding a quiet corner of the break room where she wouldn't be interrupted. Preston's handwriting was neat and precise, and the letter was 3 pages long. It started with an apology, straightforward and sincere, taking full responsibility for not being honest with her from the beginning. Then it explained his reasoning in more detail than he'd been able to during their confrontation. He wrote about how his wealth had complicated every relationship he'd ever tried to have, how people he'd thought were friends had tried to use him, how women he'd dated had been more interested in his bank account than in him as a person. He described the exhaustion and fear he'd felt when they met, how her kindness had been like a lifeline, and how terrified he'd been of losing that connection once she knew the truth. Then he wrote about falling in love with her, about how she'd made him laugh during the darkest time of his life, how talking to her had become the highlight of his day, how being with her made him want to be better. He wrote about the small moments he treasured, the way she always ordered her coffee with too much sugar, how she talked to her plants like they were her children, the sound of her laugh when she found something truly funny. He wrote about the future he'd started imagining with her, the one he was terrified he'd destroyed. The letter ended with a promise. If she'd give him another chance, he would never keep anything from her again. He would be completely honest about everything, the money, the business, all of it. He understood if she couldn't forgive him, but he needed her to know that she'd changed his life, and he would always be grateful for the time they'd had together, however brief. Olivia read the letter 3 times, crying through the second and third readings. She could feel the sincerity in every word, the genuine regret and love. And as much as she tried to stay angry with him, she couldn't deny that she understood his perspective. If she'd been in his position, wouldn't she have been hesitant to reveal that kind of wealth too? The truth was, she missed him desperately. She missed his dry sense of humor, his thoughtfulness, the way he looked at her like she was the most important person in the world. She missed the feeling of his hand in hers and the comfort of his presence. And more than that, she believed him when he said his feelings were real. She'd seen the look in his eyes when he'd told her he was falling in love with her, and that hadn't been fake. After work, instead of going home, Olivia found herself driving to the address listed on Preston's business card, which she'd looked up online. Kane's home and hardware headquarters was an impressive glass and steel building on the edge of downtown, and Olivia felt her nerves kick in as she parked and walked inside. The lobby was sleek and modern, with high ceilings and a living wall of plants that she immediately appreciated. The receptionist at the front desk looked up with a professional smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Preston Kane," Olivia said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I don't have an appointment, but could you tell him Olivia Foster is here?" The receptionist's eyes widened slightly in recognition. Clearly Preston had mentioned her. "Of course, just one moment." She picked up the phone and spoke quietly into it, then hung up and gestured toward the elevators. "Top floor. Someone will meet you there." Olivia's heart pounded as the elevator climbed. When the doors opened, a young man in a button-down shirt was waiting. "Miss Foster, I'm James, Mr. Kane's assistant. He's just finishing up a call, if you'll follow me." He led her through an open office space where people worked at standing desks and collaborated in glass-walled conference rooms, then down a hallway to a corner office with Preston's name on a placard by the door. James knocked once, then opened it. "Miss Foster is here." Preston was standing behind his desk, phone to his ear, but when he saw Olivia, his expression transformed into something between hope and disbelief. He quickly ended his call. "I'll have to call you back." He hung up without waiting for a response, his eyes never leaving Olivia. "You're here." "I got your letter," Olivia said, suddenly unsure now that she was standing in his office, seeing him in his element. He looked different here, more polished in his dress shirt and slacks, but his eyes were the same, warm and hopeful and terrified. Preston moved around his desk, stopping a few feet from her, giving her space. "Thank you for reading it. Thank you for coming." "I almost didn't," Olivia admitted. "I've been so angry and hurt, but I realized I was also being a little unfair." "You were right that I made assumptions about who you were, and you were wrong not to correct them sooner. We both messed up." "I should have told you the truth from the beginning," Preston said firmly. "There's no excuse for that. I let my fear control me instead of trusting you, and I'm sorry." "I know you are," Olivia said softly. "And I understand why you were scared. After reading your letter and really thinking about it, I get it. But Preston, if we're going to do this, if we're going to really try, I need complete honesty from here on out. About everything. I can't be in a relationship where I'm wondering what else you're not telling me." "I promise," Preston said, taking a careful step closer. "Complete honesty. About the business, the money, all of it. Ask me anything and I'll tell you the truth." Olivia thought for a moment. "How much are you actually worth?" "Around 90 million, depending on how the stock is doing. The business generates about 40 million in annual revenue across all locations. I started with one store that my father owned, saw an opportunity to expand, and built it into a chain. I was 24 when I opened the 5th location, 30 when we hit 50 stores, and 35 when we crossed 100. I owned 70% of the company, with the rest split between investors and key employees." "You have a house?" "Yes. It's about 20 minutes from here in Westfield Heights. 6 bedrooms, pool, the whole thing. I've lived there for 3 years. It's too big for one person, honestly, but I liked the property and the privacy." "Why did you really come to the hospital cafeteria that day?" Preston's expression softened. "Because I needed to get out of my father's room. The walls were closing in, and I couldn't breathe. I went to the cafeteria thinking I'd grab some air, maybe force myself to eat something, but I couldn't stop thinking about how I'd almost lost him. And then you appeared and asked if you could sit down, and suddenly I wasn't alone anymore. You have no idea how much I needed that." Olivia felt her eyes well up. "I'm glad I sat with you." "So am I," Preston said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved me that day, Olivia. And every day after that. You made me remember what it felt like to connect with someone real, to laugh, to look forward to something. I fell in love with you because of who you are, not despite anything about you. And I need you to know that the money doesn't change how I feel about you. You could be a millionaire or have nothing to your name, and I would love you exactly the same. I love you too, Olivia said, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. That's what made this so hard. I was trying to be angry with you, trying to protect myself, but I couldn't stop loving you. Preston closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. Olivia wrapped herself around him, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling the tension of the past week and a half finally release. They stood there holding each other for a long moment, neither wanting to let go. I missed you so much, Preston murmured against her hair. I miss you too, Olivia said. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. But we have to promise each other no more secrets. Even if the truth is hard or uncomfortable, we tell each other. I promise, Preston said solemnly. Then a thought occurred to him and he laughed. Does this mean I can finally take you on a proper date? Because I have been dying to take you to this restaurant that requires reservations 3 months in advance, and I've been pretending it doesn't exist. Olivia laughed, the sound like music to Preston's ears. Yes, you can take me to your fancy restaurant, but I'm also not going to feel bad about letting you pay for things anymore, so fair warning. Good, Preston said, grinning. I have a lot of dinners to make up for where you insisted on splitting the check. They left his office hand in hand, and Preston told his assistant he was taking the rest of the day off. They went to dinner at a cozy bistro, not the fancy restaurant Preston had mentioned, both of them agreeing they wanted something low-key and intimate for their reunion. Over pasta and wine, Preston told her more about the business, about his day-to-day responsibilities, about the pressures and rewards of running a large company. Olivia listened, asking questions, starting to understand the weight he carried. You like it? She asked. Running the company, I mean. Or is it just something you do? Preston considered the question seriously. I like parts of it. I like the strategy, the problem-solving, seeing the company grow and succeed. I like that we employ thousands of people and provide good jobs with benefits. But sometimes it's exhausting, and I miss the simplicity of just working with my hands, building things like I did when I was younger. You could still do that, Olivia pointed out. As a hobby, I mean, build furniture or whatever makes you happy. I'd like that, Preston said, smiling at her. See, this is what I mean. You just get it. You get me. Over the next few months, they rebuilt their relationship on a foundation of complete honesty. Preston introduced Olivia to his world gradually, taking her to charity galas and business dinners, but also making sure they maintained the simple, comfortable dynamic that had drawn them together in the first place. They still had casual dinners at hole-in-the-wall restaurants and movie nights on her couch. But now those were interspersed with weekends at his house and trips to places Olivia had always wanted to visit. Olivia met Preston's business partners and key employees, including his CFO Marcus, who told her with a grin that he'd never seen Preston this happy. Preston spent time with Olivia's family, enduring her brother's protective interrogation with good humor and winning over her parents with his genuine affection for their daughter. Her mother pulled Olivia aside during one family dinner and whispered, "He's a keeper. The way he looks at you, that's how your father still looks at me after 35 years. 6 months after they'd reconciled, Preston took Olivia to see the house he'd bought, a property in the mountains, 2 hours outside the city. It was under construction, still just framing and plans, but Preston walked her through each room, describing his vision. This will be the living room with those big windows overlooking the valley. Kitchen here, open concept. Master bedroom upstairs with a balcony. And this, He led her to what would be a spacious room with excellent natural light. I thought could be a home gym or therapy room. I know you sometimes bring work home, and I thought having a dedicated space might be nice. Olivia turned to him, her eyes shining. You designed a room for me. In your house. Our house, Preston corrected gently. If you want it to be. I know we haven't talked about moving in together officially, and there's no pressure, but I'm building this place thinking about our future, about the life I want us to have together. Olivia kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. When they broke apart, she said, Yes, I want this to be our house. I want that future with you. They moved in together that fall, once the construction was completed. Olivia gave up her tiny apartment without a second thought, excited to start this new chapter. The house was beautiful, a perfect blend of modern comfort and rustic charm, with the mountain views Preston had promised and enough space for both of them to have their own areas while still being together. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Olivia continued her work at the hospital, finding it even more fulfilling now that she could come home to Preston every night. Preston started delegating more at work, trusting his management team to handle things so he could maintain better balance. He even set up a workshop in the garage and started building furniture in his spare time, discovering that Olivia had been right about how much he'd missed working with his hands. One evening, almost a year after they'd moved in together, Preston was finishing up a bookshelf he'd been building for Olivia's ever-growing collection of medical textbooks and novels. Olivia was in the kitchen making dinner, and through the open door connecting the garage to the house, he could hear her singing along to the radio, slightly off-key like always. The domesticity of it, the simple contentment, made his chest tight with emotion. He'd been carrying the ring in his pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. But watching her now, barefoot in yoga pants and one of his old T-shirts, hair piled on top of her head in a messy bun, he realized there would never be a moment more perfect than this. This was real life, the life they'd built together, and that's exactly when he wanted to ask her. Preston cleaned up his workspace, washed his hands, and walked into the kitchen. Olivia looked up from the stove with a smile. Hey, how's the bookshelf coming? Almost done, Preston said. I'll finish it this weekend. Olivia, can you turn off the stove for a minute? Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. Is everything okay? Everything's perfect, he said, taking her hands. That's actually what I want to talk to you about. He'd had a whole speech planned, romantic words about fate and cafeterias and falling in love, but looking at her now, all of that fell away. There was only the simple truth of how he felt. You walked into my life on one of the worst days I'd ever had, and you completely changed everything, Preston said. You saw me when I felt invisible. You chose me when you could have chosen anyone else, and you've been choosing me every day since. You make me laugh, you challenge me to be better, and you love me in a way I didn't know was possible. I don't want to spend another day without you being my partner in everything. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Olivia's free hand flew to her mouth as he opened it, revealing a stunning diamond ring, elegant and classic with a platinum band. Olivia Foster, will you marry me? Yes, Olivia said through happy tears. Yes, absolutely yes. Preston slipped the ring onto her finger, and then she was in his arms, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. They stood in the kitchen, holding each other as the sun set through the windows, painting the room in shades of gold and pink. They were married 6 months later, in a ceremony that perfectly reflected both of them. The wedding took place at a beautiful estate with mountain views, with about 100 guests including family, close friends, and a few of Preston's business associates, who'd become genuine friends over the years. Olivia's brothers walked her down the aisle together, both of them managing not to cry until the vows, when their baby sister promised to love Preston through everything life might bring. Preston's father served as best man, standing beside his son with obvious pride and happiness. During the reception, Harold gave a toast that had everyone reaching for tissues. He talked about watching Preston build an empire but never really seemed fulfilled, about the fear of almost losing him to worry and stress during Harold's own health crisis, and about the miracle of Olivia walking into their lives and bringing joy back with her. "To think," Harold said, raising his glass, "it all started because my son was sitting alone in a hospital cafeteria, and this beautiful woman asked if she could sit down. If that's not fate, I don't know what is." To Preston and Olivia, may you have 50 years of choosing each other, every single day. The party lasted well into the night, with dancing and laughter, and the kind of joy that comes from watching two people who genuinely belong together start their marriage. When Preston and Olivia finally left, heading to the airport for a 2-week honeymoon in New Zealand, they did so with full hearts and excited anticipation for the future. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, as all first years are. They learned each other's habits, figured out how to navigate disagreements, and grew even closer through the process. Olivia continued her work at the hospital, eventually moving into a supervisory role that allowed her to mentor younger therapists while still maintaining contact with patients. Preston expanded the business into 2 new states, but he also made sure to maintain the work-life balance he'd fought so hard to achieve. 2 years after their wedding, Olivia came home from work with news that sent them both into excited tears. She was pregnant. They'd been talking about starting a family, had stopped preventing it from happening, but the reality of that positive test still felt miraculous. Preston was absurdly protective throughout the pregnancy, constantly checking on Olivia, reading every parenting book he could find, and driving her slightly crazy with his concern. But Olivia found it endearing more than annoying, appreciating how much he already loved their child. Their daughter was born on a snowy December morning, arriving 3 days before her due date. They named her Margaret Claire Kane, after Preston's mother and Olivia's grandmother. Maggie, as they called her, had her mother's eyes and her father's dark hair, and both Preston and Olivia fell completely in love the moment they held her, watching Preston with their daughter. Olivia fell in love with him all over again. He was a natural father, patient and gentle, completely unafraid of diaper changes or midnight feedings. He sang to Maggie, his voice soft and slightly off-key, and built her a crib with his own hands, spending weeks making sure every joint was perfect and safe. Harold was a devoted grandfather, coming over several times a week to visit his granddaughter, his health much improved and stable. He'd bring gifts and stories, telling Maggie about her grandmother even though she was too young to understand, making sure she'd grow up knowing about the woman she was named for. When Maggie was 18 months old, Olivia discovered she was pregnant again. This time with a boy who they named Thomas Harold Kane, after Preston's maternal grandfather and his father. Tommy arrived on a warm summer day, calm and easy going from the start, a perfect complement to his energetic older sister. Life became beautifully chaotic with 2 young children. The house that had once seemed almost too big was now full of toys and laughter and the constant noise of family life. Preston adjusted his work schedule to be home for dinner every night, refusing to miss bedtime stories and bath time. Olivia cut back her hours, working part-time so she could be more present while the kids were young, but still maintaining her connection to her career. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, survived terrible twos and potty training, and navigated the challenges of parenting as a team. There were hard days, days when they were exhausted and overwhelmed, but there were far more good days. Days of first words and first steps, of family dinners and weekend adventures, of watching their children grow and discover the world. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Preston took Olivia back to the hospital where they'd met. It was evening after visiting hours, and he'd gotten special permission for what he wanted to do. They walked through the familiar hallways hand in hand, ending up in the cafeteria where their story had begun. "Sometimes I still can't believe you chose my table that day," Preston said, pulling Olivia close. "Out of everywhere you could have sat, you chose me." "Best decision I ever made," Olivia said, smiling up at him. "Well, second best. Giving you another chance after you revealed you were secretly a millionaire was probably the best one," Preston laughed, the sound echoing in the empty cafeteria. "Fair point." He grew more serious, cupping her face in his hands. "I love you, Olivia. I love the life we've built, the family we're raising, every single moment we've shared. You're still the best part of every day." "I love you too," Olivia said, kissing him softly. "Thank you for being honest with me, even when it took you a while to get there. Thank you for being an amazing husband and father. Thank you for choosing me right back." They stood there in the cafeteria, holding each other, both thinking about that day 5 years ago when a simple question had changed everything. It hadn't always been easy, and they'd had to work through real challenges, but standing there in each other's arms, they both knew it had been worth every moment. Years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and joys. Maggie started kindergarten, fearless and curious about everything. Tommy followed his sister everywhere, adoring her completely. Preston and Olivia navigated the complexities of raising children with wealth, wanting to give them opportunities, but also teach them the value of hard work and kindness. They made sure the kids understood that their comfortable life was a privilege, not a right, and involved them in charity work from a young age. When Maggie was 8 and Tommy was 6, Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep. It was heartbreaking but also a gift, as he'd had years to know his grandchildren and see his son truly happy. Preston grieved deeply, but found comfort in knowing his father had lived to see him build not just a business, but a family filled with love. The business continued to thrive, and eventually Preston began the process of succession planning, grooming younger executives to take over the day-to-day operations. He wanted to step back, to spend more time with his family, to maybe teach and mentor the next generation of entrepreneurs. By the time he was 50, he'd transitioned to chairman of the board, still involved but no longer running the company directly. Olivia continued her work in physical therapy, eventually becoming the director of the entire pediatric rehabilitation department at the hospital. She loved the work, loved making a difference in children's lives, and loved that she'd found a career that fulfilled her so completely. Their children grew into remarkable young adults. Maggie, passionate and driven, went to medical school to become a pediatric surgeon. Tommy, quieter but no less determined, studied engineering and talked about designing prosthetics and mobility devices, inspired by his mother's work. Both of them had inherited their parents' desire to make a positive impact on the world. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Preston and Olivia renewed their vows in a small ceremony attended only by their children and closest friends. They stood in the same spot where they'd married 2 decades earlier, their faces lined with age and experience, but their eyes still shining with the same love that had brought them together. 20 years ago, you asked if you could sit at my table, Preston said, his voice thick with emotion. And I've spent every day since thanking whatever force in the universe brought you to me. You're still the person I want to talk to about everything, the one who makes me laugh, who challenges me, who knows me better than I know myself. I love you more today than I did then, and I'll love you even more tomorrow." "You were sitting alone in a crowded cafeteria," Olivia said, tears streaming down her face, "and something told me you were exactly where I needed to be. It was the best instinct I've ever followed. You've given me a life more beautiful than I ever imagined, filled with love and laughter and purpose. I choose you today, just like I chose you then, and I'll keep choosing you for whatever time we have left." Their children applauded, both of them wiping away tears as Preston and Olivia kissed. Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and they were alone, they sat on their deck watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "You ever think about how different things would have been if I'd sat somewhere else that day?" Olivia asked, her head resting on Preston's shoulder. "All the time," Preston admitted. "And then I remember that every choice I made, every path I took, led me to that cafeteria on that specific day at that exact time. Even the hard stuff, the scary stuff with my dad, it brought us together. I wouldn't change any of it." "Me neither," Olivia agreed. "Though I still think you should have told me about being a millionaire sooner." Preston laughed, the sound warm and familiar after all these years. "Are you ever going to let that go?" "Probably not," Olivia said cheerfully. "It's too good a story. Besides, it taught us both something important about trust and honesty. We're stronger for having worked through it." "We really are," Preston said, pulling her closer. "We're pretty damn good at this whole marriage thing, aren't we?" "The best," Olivia confirmed, tilting her face up for a kiss. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Preston and Olivia sat together in comfortable silence, hands intertwined. They'd built a life of purpose and meaning, raised children they were proud of, and loved each other through everything life had thrown at them. And it had all started with a simple question in a crowded hospital cafeteria, asked by a woman who saw a man sitting alone and decided he shouldn't be. It was proof, they both thought, that sometimes the smallest moments, the simplest choices, could change everything. That kindness could lead to love, and love could build a life more beautiful than either of them had dared to dream. They'd found each other in the most unlikely of places, fought through misunderstandings and built something real. And now they had decades of memories and a future that still stretched bright before them. The night grew cooler, and eventually they went inside, locking the door behind them and heading upstairs to their bedroom. As they got ready for bed, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of 20 years together, Preston caught Olivia's eye in the bathroom mirror and smiled. "What?" she asked, smiling back. "Nothing," Preston said. "Just thinking about how lucky I am, how grateful I am that you asked if you could sit at my table." "I'm grateful you said yes," Olivia replied, turning to wrap her arms around him. "I'm grateful for all of it, every single day." They climbed into bed together, and as Olivia settled against Preston's side, her head on his chest, she thought about how perfectly their lives had intertwined. How they'd each been exactly what the other needed, even before they'd known they needed it. How love, real love, was about choosing someone every day, through the good and the bad, and building something together that was stronger than either person alone. Preston pressed a kiss to the top of Olivia's head, feeling her breathing slow as she drifted toward sleep. He thought about that scared, exhausted man in the hospital cafeteria, alone and overwhelmed, who'd looked up to see a kind woman with a tray of questionable meatloaf. He'd been praying, without even realizing it, for someone to choose him. And she had. She'd chosen him then, and she'd kept choosing him, through revelations and challenges, through the everyday moments and the extraordinary ones. She'd chosen him, and he'd chosen her right back, and together they'd built a love story for the ages. Not because it was perfect or easy, but because it was real and hard-won and absolutely worth every moment. As sleep claimed them both, wrapped in each other's arms in the home they'd built together, surrounded by the life they'd created, Preston's last thought before drifting off was simple and true. He would choose her again, in every lifetime, in every universe. She was his person, his partner, his love, and it had all started because everywhere else was full and she'd asked if she could sit with him. Sometimes, the best love stories began with the simplest questions. And sometimes, when you said yes to a stranger in a cafeteria, you were really saying yes to your entire future, to the family you'd raise and the life you'd build, and the love that would sustain you through everything. Preston had said yes, and Olivia had sat down, and neither of them had been alone since. That was worth everything.